When I did my video on USS Yorktown's wreck last year, I didn't expect another visit so soon. Deepwater shipwrecks, not named Titanic or Bismarck, typically don't see return visits. For example, outside of Akagi and Kaga, none of Petrel's discoveries have seen a second look, at least so far. It's expensive and very time consuming, even if you know exactly where to look. With Yorktown already seeing 2 visits between Ballard and Nautilus, I certainly thought she was done. As it turned out, I was wrong. On April 19th and April 20th, 2025, Yorktown received her 3rd visit. This time, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, stopped by for a look, with this providing about 6 hours of cumulative footage of the wreck between the 2 dives. A very comprehensive examination of Yorktown's hulk. Although with less than 2 years between NOAA and Nautilus, well, there wasn't much change on the wreck. There hadn't been between Ballard and Nautilus, and that was a much longer gap. I'll link my previous video on the wreck as well, though it will be somewhat obsoleted by this. Even seriously cutting down, this is going to be my longest individual wreck video by far. The NOAA Dives, which I'll also link, were that extensive. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into things. I won't be going into detail on her sinking this time, simply because I covered that in the previous video. Still, for those who aren't familiar, a quick refresher. USS Yorktown was the only American aircraft carrier lost at the Battle of Midway. She was the subject of an intensive salvage operation after being left a listing wreck by Japanese air attack. This looked to be succeeding, at least at stabilizing the ship. Unfortunately, a Japanese submarine, I-168, would put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown on June 6, 1942, along with breaking USS Hammond in 2. This damage would be the final nail in Yorktown's coffin. The carrier rolled over and sank on June 7, 1942. Between the sinking and the battle, she lost 141 men. Her wreck would ultimately end up on the bottom at a depth of 3 miles or 5 kilometers, where she would rest silently until discovered by Robert Ballard on May 19, 1998. Yorktown was, and still is, in good condition. She's in one piece with intact paint and a lot of her equipment still aboard. This was true in 1998, and it was true in 2023 when the 2nd visit to the wreck took place. That was the visit by Nautilus in September of 2023. Much of my previous video drew from their survey, as it was quite detailed in its own right, although they had to divide their time between Yorktown, Akagi, and Kaga, which might be why things like the car or the mural escaped Nautilus, only to be found by the more dedicated survey this year. A survey that began with one of the torpedo impacts here. This is a bit further out than the equivalent look from Ballard or Nautilus. Nonetheless, you can see some of the damage here, as well as where the ship hit the bottom. When you move closer, however, that damage becomes more apparent, including the same piece of twisted metal that both previous surveys noted. People tend to think a very big hole when it comes to torpedo damage, but pieces bent out like this are just as common. The next picture actually shows where it was torn away, along with other broken and twisted metal as well. Admittedly, Japanese submarine and aircraft torpedoes weren't quite as devastating as the infamous long lance, They were smaller by necessity. Nonetheless, these were still quite lethal weapons. More than one Allied ship can speak to that fact. And you can see evidence of that even out of the area of direct damage on Yorktown, where you have a shattered and pushed in plate here. This torpedo damage, along with the fire damage on the stack, is the most distinctive on the wreck. We'll be seeing that stack damage a bit later on. For now, however, we'll move up to the hangar deck, where even in the first image, you can already see the list. Yorktown's wreck came to rest practically on its side, something we'll see later on. But even here, it's still apparent, most notably in the angle of the hangar roof. Meanwhile, the hull shows signs of rusting, the classic streaks of rusticles and other such things draped over it. Yorktown isn't anywhere near as bad as some wrecks, but she does show her age like this. Going in closer doesn't help much either. It just shows the rusticles in more detail. Although it also shows the ship in better detail too. And that's just the exterior. The interior, particularly the roof, is interesting. There's something hanging from it. I'm not quite sure what it actually is. Even a closer look like this one just shows more of it. It looks like metal, particularly here. Maybe shutters. If anyone has a better idea, by all means toss it in the comments. Either way, this close-in look also shows the various piping you'd expect on any warship. Some angled down here, and the crisscrossing pattern here. That's more easily identifiable, even if there are more rusticles in the way. However, without much else to note in this area, let's zoom back out. Here we can see a bit further along the hangar, though there's not much detail. This is a pretty featureless part of the hull until you get closer to the catwalk, and much of it is in shadow on top of that. On the other hand, this area should be familiar if you've looked at Petrol's survey of USS Hornet, or my video, I suppose. This is where Hornet's famous tug would be located on her wreck. To be more specific, right here. The piping is almost identical, as are the other details here and here. Even the chain is the same, although it's fallen down. It's incredibly rare, to say the least, to get such a close comparison between different shipwrecks. Even if you have sister ships on the bottom, they're often in very different condition. Yorktown and Hornet, at least here, are nearly identical, even down to having an interesting vehicle in frame. Hornet had her tug. Yorktown has an aircraft, or at least parts of one. It's hard to see here, but you can faintly make out the star roundel. When zooming in, on the other hand, it becomes much clearer, both the roundel and the shape of the wing itself, resting against the far side of the hangar, pressed up on the wall. At first glance, this looks more like a spare than an active aircraft. The wing isn't connected to any airframe I can see. That could have been destroyed, but it's hard to say for sure. There might be an engine here, but again it's too dark to be absolutely certain, even when zoomed in. As for the wing, there was some argument in the dive footage on what this came from, between it being a Devastator or a Dauntless wing, with the potential of it being from a Wildcat discarded based on the shape. I'd personally lean for a Devastator simply because I don't see any sign of the air brakes of an SBD. On the other hand, it could just be out of frame. Regardless, let's move on. In this case, a bit further up. There's a couple things I want to note here. First, the remains of one of the hangar shutters here. I don't remember seeing that on the footage from Nautilus when they examined this area. That said, I do remember seeing and covering this area here, the tanks and the open entrance to the ship. At the time, I didn't know exactly where this led to. During the NOAA expedition, however, they noted this likely leading to the captain's quarters. Most likely, anyway, there was some questioning going on about that. Even if it does, there's not much to see on the inside, not even when zoomed in, because the orientation of the wreck makes it difficult to look inside here. It's not much better further along either. Here we have some busted up catwalk, along with another entrance, this time apparently to the Admiral's cabin. Again, there's not much we can see on the interior. Something seems to have fallen over here, but it's not clear what. I do wonder if this catwalk is the same one we see here back in 1942, or at least in the same general area. In any event, after looking here, the ROV went a bit higher up, giving us two things: our best look at Yorktown's deck and a better look at the island's superstructure. We'll start with the flight deck. Much of the catwalk is missing in this area. Only a little bit here remains, and even that is damaged, leaving this a rather open area on the flight deck, though it probably made it easier to bring up the ROV. There was less concern of it crashing into something. Admittedly not an issue once you get past the catwalk. Yorktown's deck is, of course, a featureless plane, at least at a glance. Details are apparent when you look closer, such as here where we have that catwalk, but also, more notably, some intact wood, at least for a certain value of intact. Then again, after 80 years underwater, that's impressive enough in its own right. That aside, since the flight deck has little of note outside of the elevators and the expansion joints here, the next set of images will be the superstructure, where the higher fidelity imagery from this dive really begins to pay off, because even at a distance, we can see quite a bit of detail, from missing side plating to various catwalks. And when closer in, that just becomes more apparent. Since this is an area that Nautilus and Ballard studied pretty well, I won't linger long here today. There's more than enough for a future dedicated video on the superstructure itself. But for now, we'll focus on other areas. As such, there's only two things I want to note here. First, that the condition hasn't changed much in the last 2 years. Not that I expected it would, but it's still worth noting. And secondly, that the closer you get to the flight deck, the worse the damage becomes. The bomb that Yorktown took in this area penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the uptakes. This caused a lot of fire, and you can see the results of that. And that's because fire-damaged metal, especially as thin as this, rusts a lot faster, as you can see from flight deck level. Moving past that, the bridge structure itself is in much better shape. We have what I believe is the air control station here. This was studied by both previous surveys as well, because it's a very distinctive area, from the fire damage in the paint to the overall structure itself, which has, in contrast to the stack, remained in more or less one piece, whereas the stack, even where it connects to the bridge, is not, with gaping holes and clearly rusted metal. The control station, meanwhile, has survived well. None of the interior fittings seem to be there, and there's a cable draped across it, but the actual damage is fairly minimal. Even the window frames are intact, both the fixed ones on the side and these opening frames on the top. Those are missing the glass, of course, but the frames themselves are intact, and open to varying degrees. with this particular image also showing us one of the more interesting weapons on Yorktown's wreck, a 50 caliber machine gun, something that is very early war, as these were rapidly phased out by 20mm cannon. They were simply too light to do much more than annoy attacking aircraft. And as was painfully learned, by the time the lighter weapons could engage, the target had already dropped its bomb or torpedo. This is why even the 20mm cannon were eventually phased out, in addition to the kamikaze threat. That said, this gun is in decent shape. The water jacket is intact, as is the receiver. The mount is in worse shape, and its companion gun here is outright missing. Nearby, however, we have more of the good preservation. The ready ammunition locker, which still has the plaque legible. It's also firmly closed shut. Moving on, we'll have a couple looks at the bridge proper. First, this one from further out. Again, there's not much apparent damage. Even the paint is largely intact. The worst damage actually comes from the fire director, which is rough. From closer in, meanwhile, we have an intact blast shutter, right here next to the ladder, with another one visible in the next image, along with a bell that has remained in place with USN faintly visible. And that rounds off the bridge, at least for today. Now we'll move to the first truly new part of this survey, and that's the look inside the hangar at the famous mural. This wouldn't have been visible at all if not for Yorktown's elevators being open. That allowed the ROV to penetrate inside the hangar, where we find this, something known only from the historical record, a chart of the cruises of the USS Yorktown. To my knowledge, no one knows exactly who painted it. Whoever it was, they did a good job. It's remarkably well preserved. And as the name implies, this was a chart of Yorktown's cruises. A painting of the globe with a mirror image of Yorktown herself on either side. While the finer details have faded, this originally had the countries outlined in red, and Yorktown's own voyages charted in blue lines. You can't see that from this far out, but it's still interesting even at this distance. And when you do move in, interesting details start to appear, like the compass at the bottom flanked by seahorses, which has endured the years quite well, even as the colors fade. You've also got details like Hawaii and Midway here, with some of the red outlines still intact. Unfortunately, moving past this point, some of the mural is covered in rusticles. Those obscure the details here. And yet, despite that, the overall painting remains in good shape, with even some of the tracks of Yorktown's voyage still faintly visible, either in the original blue or in faded white. Even with the overgrowth, this remains an impressive piece of artwork. It's a shame that it's stuck 3 miles down, especially when you look at Yorktown in her pre-war glory, complete with the large Y painted onto her stack. Similar to Saratoga's famous stripe, this was an ID marker. This does make me wish that surviving photos of the mural in its glory could be located. It really is an impressive piece of art for a sailor or sailors to have done in their free time. In any case, however, it's time to move on. The only thing left to note in the hangar is this here, what seems to be fire damage. It looks like the paint bubbled up to me, or even the metal itself. It's a bit hard to tell. That makes the preservation of the mural all the more impressive. Though, with that covered, it's time to leave the hangar. First to one of Yorktown's gun galleries, where we have incredibly well-preserved 20mm cannon. These are normally rusted out and covered in silt. On Yorktown, they're completely visible, both from a distance and from up close. A level of preservation that also applies to her 5-inch guns, as you can see here. The mount has the typical covering if you've watched my videos. What's less typical is the rope on this one. I believe this is evidence of the crew preparing to toss it overboard, because the historical record indicates they were doing this to try and lighten the ship in order to fight the list. But when Yorktown was torpedoed, all those efforts came to a halt, and we might be seeing evidence of that here. Either way, the next set of images move to the ship's stern, where we have her name, Yorktown, still visible. All the paint has faded away, but the letters are still there. Not that there was any doubt which ship this was, of course, but the point remains. You can also see how far over Yorktown is here, based on where her stern touches the bottom. While further up the stern, we see more evidence of damage. The aft portion of the flight deck was torn up during the sinking. Metal is broken, and the deck itself has large chunks missing. It's not pretty, and is probably the most direct damage to the deck itself. It even exposes internal framework here, with the aft elevator faintly visible in the background. The interior of that elevator being probably the most interesting thing on this portion of the wreck, because we have at least 3 aircraft all tangled up together. They look like Dauntlesses, though the condition of the aircraft is not exactly good, closer to the wrecks near Hornet than the broadly intact aircraft near Lexington. It doesn't help that the planes seem to have rusted together in a pile, though at least one still has visible markings here, while another is recognizable as a Dauntless from the dive breaks, and of course the bomb still suspended from it. These aircraft were likely prepping for launch, and ended up stuck together at some point during the sinking, where they've been since the carrier came to rest on the bottom, with this one also a Dauntless based on the dive flaps again. For as weird as their situation is, however, the weirder thing is the car found on the wreck. As I just covered this, I'll just note this. That car is some form of a Ford, likely a Woody model. While it's not entirely clear who it belonged to, it is a staff car. Maybe the captain's, or maybe Admiral Fletcher's. It could also be a crew-owned car for use ashore. Regardless of which it is, the car was left in place when Yorktown sailed to battle, and it wasn't pushed overboard, leading to it remaining on the wreck to this day. One of the more interesting relics on a warship wreck, to say the least. And also one of the last things for this video. We'll round things off with 2 images of the superstructure. First, this one, where we have a Chicago piano mount stuck beneath a collapsed crane. I like this for showing how even something as mundane as a crane can be interesting on a shipwreck, which also applies to the last picture, the top of Yorktown's stack, where we can see the exhaust. Not something that would normally be very interesting, but on a shipwreck, it is interesting, especially because we don't get a similar look at Hornet, and Enterprise is long gone. It seemed a good place to end to me, although by no means the end of this wreck or the dive footage. I'll likely be doing follow-ups based on specific portions of the wreck. There's that much material to cover. I don't believe we've had any warship wrecks surveyed so well outside of Bismarck. NOAA did a very, very good job here. Go watch their live stream archives. It's worth it, trust me. Thank you for watching, Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.